Imagine you wake up to find yourself shipwrecked in a new and strange land. Yourself and just 3 companions are the last survivors of a doomed expedition. You have no food, no clothing, no weapons, and no maps. Ahead lies an entire continent never before seen by outsiders. Your only chance is to venture forwards into the unknown and pray that somehow you can make it home alive. This is the exact situation a Spanish explorer named Cuba de Vaca found himself in the year of 1528. He had come in search of treasure and glory, but was now locked in a desperate fight for survival. He would face horrific marches through the swamps of Florida, sail oceans on makeshift rafts, and endure years of enslavement at the hands of native people. This story remains relatively unknown, and honestly is perhaps the most insane journey I've covered on this channel. I am so excited to share this with you. Let us begin and travel across the wilds of America with Cuba de Vaca. Welcome to the Great Explorers. So how did a Spanish nobleman end up naked and starving on the edge of a continent? Well, Cuba de Vaca did not arrive on that lonely beach by accident. He was the product of a moment in history. You see, in the early 1500s, Spain was ever hungry for conquest. Just 30 years before, Christopher Columbus had sailed across the Atlantic Ocean and discovered a chain of islands, which we call the Caribbean. The Spanish quickly established settlements across these islands, and they became a sort of outpost for new expeditions to set out from. For example, it was from Cuba that the conquistador Hernan Cortés launched his fateful expedition in 1519. He landed in Mexico with 500 men, and within just 2 years managed to bring down the mighty Aztec Empire. I mention this because the implications of Cortés's victory in Mexico were enormous. It was proof that there were vast lands to the west which contained rich empires ripe for plundering. For every ambitious Spaniard, this was what they dreamed of, a land of riches to conquer. And by the way, no European had any understanding of the size of North America. On their maps, it was practically an empty space. The geography, wildlife, and people one would find was all a great mystery. But conquistadors were certain of one thing: in all that space, there must be more civilizations to plunder. The race was on. If Cortés could conquer an empire with 500 men, what more may lie beyond? And so it would not be long before another Spaniard named Pánfilo de Narváez stepped up to explore the unknown lands. Narváez will play an important role in our story, as he is the leader of the expedition we will discuss. For background, Pánfilo de Narváez was a conquistador, which by the way basically means a soldier, and in 1526 he was given a royal charter to go explore and settle the unknown lands of the Gulf Coast, which covers a huge amount of land from Florida to Mexico. It was a huge opportunity. So, where did Narváez go to plan this daring expedition? Well, at the time, all explorations originated in Seville, Spain. It was Spain's only port licensed to do business with the American colonies. As a result, it was a beehive of activity and the perfect place to hire a crew. Now, because Narváez was given permission to not just explore, but also found settlements in Florida, he would need to bring a lot of people and supplies. He purchased 5 ships, which would carry over 600 men in total. There was a whole range of people joining the expedition, from physicians, artisans, masons, and carpenters, all people who would be needed to help start the settlements. And if you're wondering what the incentive was for these people to come along on such a dangerous expedition, well, the primary reason was money. Narváez had the power to hand out land and important political positions, so these poor souls were simply chasing a better life. Even a few peasants, who could not offer much in terms of their skill sets, were permitted to come along just to help boost the numbers. Also among the expedition were 10 married women who were loyally following their husbands into this dangerous new world. The last few members of the expedition consisted of religious friars who would try to convert any natives to Christianity, and a handful of royal officials who would ensure the interests of the Spanish crown were being met. Belonging to this last group is our main character, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, and so now is a good time to introduce him. Cabeza de Vaca was a slim man in his mid-30s. He was from a family of minor nobility, meaning he had not been born into great wealth, but neither was he poor. Middle class is probably the best description. Much of his early life remains uncertain. It is believed that he lost his parents while still young, though the record is unclear. What we do know is that he pursued a military career. He enlisted in the army and in 1512 fought at the Battle of Ravenna in Italy. Later, in 1521, he served in Spain during a civil war. These campaigns brought him experience, but more importantly, connections at the Spanish court. At the time of the expedition, he was well respected, which is likely why he was chosen to go along as the royal treasurer. By the way, I should note here that as royal treasurer, Cabeza de Vaca was loyal to the emperor above all else. His job was to make sure the crown received its fair share of any profits resulting from the expedition. This meant that he had the power to challenge Narvaez, the expedition leader, if needed. At times, this will strain their relationship. So, on the 17th of June, 1527, the hopeful expedition, consisting of 5 ships, set off from Spain. They travelled south for 10 days before stopping in the Canary Islands in order to resupply with water, food, and wood. From there, they set out across the Atlantic. The passengers quickly began to grasp the discomfort of long ocean voyaging. Today, we take for granted the fact we can jump on a plane and travel thousands of miles in relative comfort. But believe me when I say, life in the boats was extremely difficult. This is what the settlers faced. The ships were cramped beyond belief. It is estimated that a 16th century ship like this consisted of only 1,600 feet of habitable space, which is roughly the size of an average apartment. And that was where 100 human beings had to live for weeks, including eating and going to the toilet. If you do the math, it works out that each individual would only have around 1.8 square yards of space to themselves. Needless to say, conditions were awful. The heat below deck was often unbearable, which is where the slaves were forced to sleep. Other passengers would just find any clear space on deck to rest. And we shouldn't forget that there were loose animals such as chickens, pigs, sheep, and even horses struggling on the deck. The ships quickly became infected with fleas and rats, which caused more discomfort and the threat of disease. It was a hellish environment to live in for over a month, but at last, in late July 1527, the ships glimpsed the island of Hispaniola, which would be their first stop. The rolling green hills must have looked like paradise after the torture of the Atlantic crossing. Everyone was relieved to have survived the journey. Now the island, which at the time was called Hispaniola, is what we today know as the island that makes up the countries of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Back in the 1500s, it was the hub of Spanish activity in the Caribbean. Narvaez and his fleet pulled into the town of Santo Domingo in order to resupply and purchase more horses. Horses, by the way, were incredibly important for any expedition. The indigenous people of North America had never encountered such animals before the Spanish arrived. For them, the sight of a mounted armoured conquistador was a terrifying thing to behold. Along with steel armour and weapons, the animals gave the Spanish a huge advantage in battle over the natives. Hernán Cortés had used horses with devastating effect against the Aztec Empire, and because of this, Narvaez aimed to acquire as many as possible. However, what the expedition leader didn't know is that the terrain of Florida is wildly different to that of Mexico and will prove extremely difficult for the horses. But we are not there quite yet. Anyway, while the ships were resupplied, the passengers and crew enjoyed themselves around Santo Domingo. The frontier town was a bustling hive of activity, and everyone was eager to hear of the latest news. Santo Domingo was the gateway to the New World, and ships arrived and departed daily, carrying stories of discovered gold or beaches rich with pearls. It felt as if fortunes could be made overnight if one only picked the right ship to sign up on. And for some of Narvaez's men, this temptation proved too great. Within 2 weeks, 140 men had deserted from the expedition in order to stay in town and chase better opportunities. They must have felt that the Florida expedition was too dangerous, and there was no need to take such a big risk. In the coming months, this decision will prove to be the wisest any of them ever made. But let's keep going. Since there was a shortage of both horses and men in Santo Domingo, Narvaez announced they would sail to Cuba for one final supply stop before heading to Florida. However, fate would soon intervene. In Cuba, Narvaez struck a deal with a wealthy friend to buy some more horses. The only problem was they were located in the town of Trinidad, on the other side of the island. Narvaez sent Cabeza de Vaca with 2 ships to go and retrieve the animals. Cabeza arrived safely in Trinidad and began loading the horses. However, it was here that the expedition received its first bad luck. While loading the provisions, a hurricane descended on the 2 ships. At first, the weather worsened with a strong wind and dark skies. Then the sea rose and waves began to rage against the hulls. Their anchorage was not well protected, and Cabeza de Vaca considered trying to move the ships somewhere safer. But before he had a chance, the full force of the hurricane hit. The Spanish had never seen anything like it. Their world became wind and water. If you don't know, Caribbean hurricanes are born far out over the Atlantic, where the sun heats warm ocean water. When the sea surface reaches roughly 26 degrees Celsius, it releases enormous energy into the atmosphere. Warm air rises, creating a low pressure system beneath it that attracts more air, and the entire mass starts to spin. What begins as thunderstorms can quickly turn into vast spinning engines of wind and rain 100 miles wide. They are more than capable of tearing masts from ships and sinking entire fleets. For the Spanish, it was a biblical spectacle to behold. Cabeza de Vaca retreated to the town for safety and described his experience, writing, quote, "All the houses and churches blew down, and it was necessary for us to band together in groups of 7 or 8 men, our arms locked with another, in order to save ourselves from being carried away from the wind. In this great storm and continual danger, we walked all night, without finding an area or place where we could be safe for even half an hour." End quote. Throughout the night, the natives of Trinidad chanted and played bells to appease the gods. The Spanish also believed the hurricane had religious meaning and thought it was the work of the devil. At last, when dawn came the next day and the wind had died down, Cabeza de Vaca and 30 survivors went to inspect the ships. They were completely gone. Apart from a few planks of wood, there was not a trace. They launched a search party and 1 mile away found a rowing boat on top of a tree. 25 miles away, 2 bodies were recovered that were unrecognizable due to them being battered so much. In total, the Florida expedition had lost 2 ships, 20 horses, and 60 men to the hurricane. It was an omen of what was to come. I just want to pause here for a moment to say how glad I am that you guys are enjoying these videos. Each one takes months of research, writing, and editing, so reading your comments honestly means a lot. I genuinely think this channel has one of the best comment sections on YouTube, so thank you for that. Just a quick note to say that if you do enjoy these documentaries, please consider becoming a member of the channel. It only costs about $4 a month, and it genuinely makes a huge difference in helping me keep making videos like this. I've never really wanted to take sponsors, mainly because I have no interest in trying to sell you an app that you probably don't need. But these projects do take a huge amount of time, and this is one of the best ways to support my work. And here's the honest part. If you become a member, you probably won't get a huge amount extra for it, which I know is probably the opposite of what I should be saying. I'm clearly not a very good salesperson. But seriously, all my time goes into making these videos, so it's just a great way to support the channel. Sorry for the interruption, and let's get back to the story. Now, after the hurricane disaster, the expedition was thrust into chaos. Narvaez was forced to delay departure to Florida in order to replace the lost ships and recruit more men. It would take over 4 months for the expedition to recover in Cuba, and this lost time was a considerable financial setback for Narvaez, who had 1,000 things to worry about. One of the biggest difficulties was finding an experienced pilot who would be able to guide the ships to Florida. Piloting a ship in the 16th century was a science and an art, and good navigators were worth their weight in gold. Pilots needed to be able to recognize coastlines and traverse dangerous waters with nothing more than a basic compass. Picking the right man could mean the difference between life and death. Eventually, in February 1528, Narvaez found a man called Diego Marullo, who seemed to have a good reputation. Now, historians have debated Marullo's identity for centuries, trying to work out whether he was actually a pilot or just a conman. I mention this because very soon, Marullo's skills will prove to be more than inadequate for the mission ahead. But anyway, he was hired, and with this last missing piece of the puzzle, the expedition was ready to get going. Before we set off, I just want to make clear where exactly the expedition was aiming to reach. The royal charter Narvaez had been granted gave him permission to explore, conquer, and settle the lands along the entire Gulf Coast of North America. It was a huge stretch of land that encompasses modern-day Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Arizona, and large parts of Mexico. The Spanish knew practically nothing about these territories except that the lands were enormous. Back in Spain, many thought the emperor had been far too kind in granting Narvaez such reach. In truth, this area of land was 4 times larger than Spain itself. So, for the first time in history, Pánfilo de Narvaez could technically claim to rule most of North America. Anyway, Narvaez decided the first goal of the expedition would be the east coast of Mexico. There, somewhere along the coast, early scouts had reported a river that flowed into the mainland. If true, it would be an excellent place to plant settlements and establish control over the region. Other early sailors had mentioned the river with interest, and Narvaez was eager to investigate for himself. So now our story is fully underway. I just want to mention 2 quick points before we continue. You might be wondering about sources for this story. Well, the primary source is called the La Relación, which was written by Cabeza de Vaca himself after the whole ordeal. It's an excellent piece of writing and offers many insights into the journey. However, as he wrote it himself, we do have to take a few things with a pinch of salt, especially in regards to his own actions. He obviously had an incentive to make himself look good, so just bear that in mind. Alongside this document, we also have the official expedition records and a joint survivor account, which was written by 2 captains we will encounter shortly. I hope that makes the sources clear. The second thing is, please forgive me if I mispronounce anything in this video. I do not speak Spanish, but I have done some research and will try my best. Thank you, and let's keep going. So at last, in February 1528, 5 ships and approximately 400 men set off from Cuba's south coast. However, they would run into trouble almost immediately. Only 3 days after leaving port, the ships sailed into an area called the Canarios Archipelago, which is a treacherous maze of reefs, shoals, and shallow water. Navigating this place was incredibly difficult for even the best pilots, and the man Narvaez had hired for the job, Diego Marullo, was clearly not up to the task. The ships were stuck for 15 days, with the hulls frequently rubbing the sand and rocks below. The expedition's supplies were already dwindling, and they had hardly left the coast of Cuba. It was not a good start. Cabeza de Vaca wrote that the only reason that they managed to escape was because, quote, a storm brought so much water into the shallows that we were able to get out, although not without great danger, end quote. Doubt began to spread among the crew regarding the ability of the pilot, but the expedition had no choice but to press on. As the ships worked their way up the coast of Cuba, they experienced more bad luck. They were hit by 3 storms in a row, and Cabeza de Vaca reports that they narrowly avoided shipwreck. By this point, many of the passengers believed God was trying to send them a message and that they should return home. But Narvaez was not going to quit, and soon the ships had left Cuba behind and were sailing out into the Gulf of Mexico. As a quick side note here, I know a certain president has elected to rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, and if I don't mention this, I'm sure I will receive some comments. Since I'm just a young man from England and don't have a dog in this fight, I will continue to call it the Gulf of Mexico. I hope you are all okay with that. Side note done. Anyways, after a few days of sailing across the Gulf, the cries of land ho rang out. Ahead of them lay a coastline emerging from the horizon. Diego Marullo and the other pilots believed this was the eastern coast of Mexico, close to where the river was reported to be. Everyone was overjoyed that the voyage had been uneventful since leaving Cuba. The sight of a new land and potential riches boosted the spirits of everyone. However, what they didn't know is that the coastline was not, in fact, Mexico. In an extraordinary error, the expedition was staring at the western coast of modern-day Florida, close to Tampa Bay. The pilots had misjudged their location by over 900 miles. It was a colossal mistake and will have deadly consequences. So how could they make such a terrible error? Well, there are likely a few reasons. First, we have to question the skill of the pilot Marullo, since his track record was not good. He had almost doomed the ships in Cuba, and now this was another calamity. But to be honest, trying to navigate across unfamiliar oceans in the 16th century was a very difficult task. The pilots used a combination of dead reckoning and basic charts. They estimated the speed of the ships by looking at the bubbles on the sea. There was a huge amount of guessing involved in any ocean voyage. And unknown to everyone, there was a very powerful force working against them. The ships were battling the Gulf Stream, which is the fastest ocean current in the world. If you don't know, the power of the Gulf Stream is immense. It is equal to almost 2,000 Mississippi rivers flowing together under the ocean in a snake of warm water. Anything in its way, debris, litter, plants, and even fish, can be propelled 100 miles in a single day. In the 1500s, European captains were regularly astonished when they encountered these waters. Even when they had a favourable wind, their ships could be pushed in the wrong direction for miles. For Narvaez and the expedition, it may have seemed like they were making progress from the deck of the ship, but they were completely oblivious to the forces at work beneath them. Now, there would have been some signs that something was amiss. For example, from their location, the sun was setting on the sea rather than over land, which would be the case if they were truly near Mexico. But despite these warning signs, the pilots put it down to the fact that coastlines can be misleading at first glance. They decided to keep the information to themselves for now, for fear of making themselves look even worse in the eyes of Narvaez. I think this is all just a reminder of how little knowledge there was about this part of the world. It truly was a new and strange land. The expedition spent the following 2 days sailing along the coast, hoping to meet the mouth of the river, until on April 15th they came to a shallow bay. It was there that they spotted the first Indian village. Narvaez, full of confidence, decided to give the Indians a display of strength. he ordered everyone to disembark the ships, which was needed anyway after the long voyage. But despite Narvaez's confidence, the expedition was not in a good way. Over half the horses had died on the journey, mostly due to the intensity of the storms around Cuba. The remaining 42 animals were weak and could hardly be mounted. This meant that the Spanish were mostly deprived of their most important military advantage. They would have to manage without. Luckily, at the sight of these strange people, the natives decided to evacuate the village. The Spanish quickly investigated and took anything of value. The most promising item they found was a ceremonial golden rattle. This discovery of gold gave everyone hope that perhaps there was a rich civilization nearby to be conquered. Narvaez wasted no time in formally claiming the land for Spain, despite not knowing his actual location. Then he decided to set up camp so they could explore the surrounding area. Over the following days, he sent out a scouting party, which followed the coast to the north. They quickly came to, quote, a very large bay that seemed to go far inland, end quote. We know this today as Tampa Bay, Florida. The scouts quickly returned to the expedition and shared their findings. The news of the bay caused confusion, as according to their basic maps, there was no bay of this size near the river in Mexico. It began to dawn on everyone that perhaps they were not where they thought. Anyway, another scouting party was sent out to explore the bay in more depth. However, the men ran into a group of Indians and after a brief skirmish, took 4 of them captive. After some threats, the Indians guided the Spanish to their nearby village, and it was here that things escalated. To their great surprise, the scouts found Spanish crates in the village, and inside them were the bodies of dead Spanish soldiers. The Indians had covered them in painted deer hides as a sign of great respect. There were also other European items laying around, like shoes, cloth, and iron. After some intense questioning, which was difficult to say the least with the language barrier, it was concluded that the Indians had discovered these items on the beach at shipwreck. However, when the scouts returned to the main camp and shared the news, the religious friars in the expedition were outraged. They believed that the way the Indians had treated the dead was sacrilegious and demanded that the bodies and items to be burned. The Indians were deeply confused, as in their minds they had treated the dead with great respect. It was the first time these Indians witnessed the abusiveness of the Spanish and the vast differences between their cultures. Future disputes were just a matter of time. Anyway, it was discovered that the Indians by the bay also possessed some gold pieces. The Spanish questioned them extensively, seeking to know where they acquired the precious metal. Cabeza de Vaca wrote that the natives said, quote, very far away from there was a province called Apalachee, in which there was much gold, and they made signs to indicate that there were very great quantities of everything we held in esteem, end quote. Now, what the Indians are doing here is a tactic that we have encountered in previous videos on my channel. When an explorer, or an invader, questions a local population for precious materials, the indigenous people are clever and say, oh, that thing you want really bad, it's really far away in that direction. In other words, they say whatever they can to make the strange men disappear. And once again, it worked. Narvaez took the bait. The promise of rich Indians, perhaps even another Aztec empire, was too good of an opportunity to ignore. At the camp, he called a meeting with the expedition's most senior members and announced his plan. Narvaez stated the expedition was to split up. All the healthy men and horses were to travel on foot inland until they reached the fabled river, which they still believed to be close by. Meanwhile, the sailors and women would stay on the ships and sail along the coast to the mouth of the river, where they would wait for the overland group. It was a daring plan, but not unprecedented. Other expeditions had successfully pulled off similar maneuvers in the past. Narvaez believed that the land force would be able to move faster than the ships, which would have to navigate a dangerous coast. And it was clear the horses needed to be on land, rather than growing weaker each passing day in the ships. Besides, it also meant that they could explore and raid any Indian settlements along the way, hopefully ones that possessed gold. Now, I will point out that there were mixed reactions among the men. Many supported the idea of the overland march, as they were reluctant to get back on the ships. They had narrowly escaped destruction before and thought God was sending them a message. However, there were others who disagreed. The most vocal dissenter was Cuba the Pilot himself. He argued that it was foolish to cut themselves off from the ships. They had no reliable maps, and there was not even an agreed meeting point down the coast. The men would simply be hoping to remain in sight of the shoreline, an uncertain strategy at best. Besides, the land ahead looked intimidating. There were rivers and swamps, meaning travel would not be easy. The horses were already weakened from the voyage and would struggle with long marches through difficult terrain. And perhaps most critically of all, the expedition was running out of food. If they failed to find game to hunt, they would soon face starvation. Now, Cuba the Pilot's later writings are the only source we have for this meeting, so it is worth remembering that he had the benefit of hindsight. Whether he really voiced all these concerns at the time is impossible to know. However, it seems likely he thought the plan was foolish to some extent. I will mention that the 10 married women on the ships also disliked Narvaez's plan. They were scared of leaving their husbands and facing an uncertain future without them. But despite the debate, ultimately Narvaez came out on top. The dream of riches lured the men to take the gamble. It will prove to be a grave mistake. Narvaez did decide to regain some control of the expedition by publicly shaming Cuba the Pilot as a coward. He told him if he was so scared of the march that he should stay on the ships with the women. The royal treasurer could not let his honour be trampled by such an accusation, and so reassured everyone he would join the land party. He later wrote, quote, "I preferred risking my life to placing my honour in jeopardy," end quote. And so, in mid-April 1528, the two groups said their farewells. It was the last time they would ever see each other. Once the ships disappeared along the coast, all that remained on shore was Narvaez, Cuba the Pilot, 300 Spaniards, a handful of slaves, and 40 skinny horses. They were alone in a new world, the wilds of Florida. For the next few weeks, the men marched through a labyrinth of water and forest. Florida's landscape consists of vast swamps, winding rivers, and endless marshes. The climate is subtropical, bringing heavy rains and suffocating humidity. There are forests so dense that sunlight barely penetrates the ground. And that's not to mention the insects. Mosquitoes plagued the men and drove them mad. Their armour and weapons soon rusted due to the moisture. Every mile had to be earned through blood and sweat. Progress was painfully slow, and the horses suffered the worst. This was perhaps the worst environment imaginable for the poor animals. At times, the men waded through waist-deep water. Their clothes were permanently wet and began to rot. The men heard strange noises in the trees from animals they had never seen. It felt as if a native ambush could be around every corner. But out of all these dangers and discomforts, food was the constant thought in the minds of the men. Within a few days, they had run out of the last provisions from the ship. If they wanted to eat, they had to catch it. In terms of wildlife, the men spotted deer, rabbits, bears, and even the elusive Florida panther. Cuba reports seeing a creature that carried its young in a pouch, which was certainly the opossum. Many of these creatures were new to the Spanish, and they were stunned by the quantity of life. Interestingly, Cuba did not report seeing any alligators, although he almost certainly would have encountered them. Despite this abundance of life, the men struggled to hunt, and even when they were successful, the meat could spoil in a matter of hours. Instead, their main meal was an edible palm tree, which was similar to one that grew in Spain. It did little to fill their stomachs. For 2 weeks, they forged on through the wilderness. The men were starving and in desperate need of a proper meal. Don't forget, there were approximately 400 men. That's a lot of mouths to feed. But then, one day, after crossing a strong river, they came upon a band of roughly 200 native people. The Indians were shocked and confused to see these strange newcomers emerge from out of the swamps. Cabeza de Vaca describes the first encounter, writing that Narvaez, quote, went out to them after having spoken to them by means of signs. They gestured to us in such a way that we had to turn on them, end quote. The meeting descended into a small skirmish. The Indians made threatening gestures towards the Spanish, and the conquistadors quickly responded with violence. What the Spanish didn't understand is that in the wilds of Florida, rivers were boundaries between different tribes. By crossing the river armed and unannounced, they were perceived as invaders. Anyways, during the brief fight that followed, the Spanish managed to capture 5 or 6 Indians. After some threatening, the captives led them to their nearby village. The Spanish were overjoyed to discover an abundance of ripe corn the Indians had harvested. They devoured as much as they could. Cabeza de Vaca wrote, quote, "We gave infinite thanks to our Lord for having aided us in so great a need," end quote. Now, while the spirits of the men were briefly lifted, I should mention that not all was well within the expedition. The rift between Narvaez and Cabeza de Vaca was widening. The last 2 weeks had been torturous, and Cabeza was increasingly convinced they were making a mistake by straying so far from the coast. What's more, many of the others were beginning to share his concern. They urged Narvaez to send some scouts back towards the shoreline. The men argued that the river they had just crossed could be the one they had been seeking all along. The ships may be waiting at its mouth, just a few miles away. But Narvaez was hell-bent on proceeding inland in search of the wealthy kingdom he believed lay ahead. At first, he dismissed all pleas to go to the coast, but eventually relented and agreed for Cabeza to go with 40 men to search for the ships. Likely he wanted to be rid of the royal treasurer, who was becoming a thorn in his side. So the next day, Cabeza de Vaca set off for the coast. He was accompanied by the company of men and 2 captains, named Alonso del Castillo and Andres Dorantes. I mention these 2 because they will play an important role in our story. For now, all you need to know is they both came from respected families, were men of faith, and had joined the expedition in search of fame and fortune. Anyway, after a few hours, the men reached a shallow bay. There was no sign of the ships. They waded into the water and found that it only came up to their knees for a distance of 5 miles. It would be impossible for a ship to reach this place. Defeated, Cabeza de Vaca had no choice but to return to Narvaez and the main party, and soon the expedition resumed its journey inland towards the kingdom of the Appalachia. The royal treasurer had tried to talk sense, but could do no more. From that moment on, there was no turning back. The expedition left the coast behind and pushed deeper into the wilderness. Hunger soon returned, and the men frequently walked 20 miles without finding anything edible. The horses were struggling, often getting stuck in the mud. And they were not alone. From time to time, they saw Indian scouts observing them from a distance before disappearing like ghosts. It unnerved everyone. Then, one day, a group of Indians fearlessly walked right into the Spanish camp, which sent everyone into panic. The newcomers played reed flutes as they came near, and their chief was carried on the shoulders of his men. Narvaez spent an hour communicating with the chief through sign language and gave him precious beads and bells as a sign of friendship. Before long, it became clear that these people were sworn enemies of the Appalachia and were more than willing to point the Spanish in the right direction. The next day, the Spanish and Indians walked together until they came to another large river. We think this was likely the Suwannee River. One Spanish soldier named Juan Velasquez grew impatient as the expedition prepared to cross the river. Without warning, he urged his horse forward and strode out into the white water. Well, the current was so strong that both man and animal were swept downriver. Velasquez got caught in the reins, and neither he nor the horse could free themselves. Both of them soon drowned. The Indians obviously knew this river well because they showed the Spanish exactly where to look for the bodies. That night, the men feasted on the carcass of the horse. So for over a month, the men continued the march, and slowly the terrain began to change. The trees grew taller and the air cooled as they left the tropical part of Florida and ventured into a more temperate zone. And then at last, in mid-June 1528, the expedition sighted an Appalachian village on the horizon. The men were relieved beyond belief and shook hands with one another. The thought of being so close to gold made the last few months worth it. Their hunger and exhaustion faded away. Cabeza de Vaca wrote, quote, "On finding ourselves where we desired to be, and where they told us there were so many foodstuffs and so much gold, it seemed to us that a great portion of our hardship and weariness had been lifted from us." End quote. It had been exactly 1 year since the expedition had left Spain. Now, before we continue, I think it's worth discussing the Kingdom of Appalachia for a moment, as I too was unfamiliar with it before researching this video. Unbeknown to the Spanish, the Appalachia was the largest and most powerful society in the Florida region. While many of the coastal Indians the expedition had encountered so far lived primarily by hunter-gathering, the Appalachia were different. The land they occupied, which is around the present-day city of Tallahassee, contained rich and fertile soils. As a result, by the time of the Narvaez expedition, the people of Appalachia were cultivating large fields of maize, beans, and squash that stretched for miles. This abundance of food meant it was possible for them to sustain larger communities, which resulted in power over the neighboring tribes. The Appalachia lived in a strict hierarchy, which was ruled by a single chief. He lived in the capital, a place called Anhaica, and controlled all the nearby village chiefs, who then ruled their own regions. These people were not scattered bands of hunter-gatherers. They were highly organized and capable of mobilizing hundreds of warriors when needed. The Spanish had no idea what they were walking into. Anyway, the village the expedition had discovered contained around 40 houses. It was well hidden in a thick wood, surrounded by lagoons. It is likely this was one of the smaller Appalachia villages, as the capital would have had around 200 houses. Narvaez immediately ordered Cabeza de Vaca to take 9 cavalrymen and 50 soldiers to attack the village. As they searched the homes, they found only women and children. It appeared the men of the village were away, perhaps hunting or working nearby fields. But as the Spaniards continued to search for food, the warriors returned. Arrows began to rain down on the invaders, and at least 1 horse was killed. Despite the resistance, the Spanish managed to occupy the village and kept the women and children as hostages. 2 days later, some Indians approached and asked for the release of the families. Narvaez agreed, but demanded that the village chief be handed over in exchange. The chief agreed and submitted himself to the Spanish. And so began a standoff between the two groups. The best option for the Spanish was to stay in the village. If they left, the natives would be able to pick them off slowly in the wilderness they knew so well. The Spaniards' superior weaponry gave them the advantage in an open battle, but it didn't stop the natives from reverting to guerrilla tactics. They set houses on fire and attacked in the dead of night before withdrawing. The Spanish were constantly alert and couldn't relax for a moment. Cabeza de Vaca wrote, quote, "The Indians made war on us continually, wounding the people and the horses as we fetched water, shooting arrows at us from the safety of the lagoons where we could not retaliate." End quote. In total, the Spanish remained in the village for 26 days. They found a large supply of corn in one of the huts, so food was not an immediate concern. But to their great disappointment, they found no gold, jewels, or treasure. As the weeks went by, the men cursed their luck. This was no Aztec empire, it was just an ordinary Indian village. They had endured months of hell for the promise of riches, but now that dream was in tatters. Had the coastal Indians lied to them? It was certainly possible. And perhaps worst of all, there was no way home. They had separated themselves from the ships, and it seemed unlikely they would ever find them again. It was not a good situation. Narvaez sent several parties of heavily armed men out to explore the surrounding area and search for a larger settlement, but the reports that came back were discouraging. The land beyond the village seemed sparsely populated and was difficult to travel. In desperation, Narvaez forcefully interrogated the village chief. The old man told the expedition leader that, quote, the largest village of the entire land was this one, and that ahead there were fewer people who were much poorer than they, and that the land was poorly populated. End quote. The truth was, the chief did a masterful job of deceiving the Spanish. He insisted that beyond this point, there was nothing of interest, heavily discouraging them from pressing on further into his territory. In reality, just to the west of their current position, there were sizable towns and even the capital of Anhaica. It was by contrast with this town, a heavily settled area. But instead, the village chief pointed the Spanish to the south, back towards the coast, where in fact there were hardly any villages at all. Cabeza de Vaca wrote that the chief claimed, quote, going to the sea was a 9-day journey, and there was a village called Ayut, and the Indians of that place had a great deal of maize, end quote. By this point, the Spanish didn't need any encouragement. They no longer spoke of empires or gold. They just wanted to get back to the coast where there was a slim chance of being rescued by the ships. The promise of food at this village named Ayut simply made the decision a little easier. Narvaez announced that they were to march there immediately, and well, things quickly began to unravel. After just 2 days of travel, the men encountered the worst swamps they had seen so far. The water was chest high, and they struggled to wade through it, carrying their armor, weapons, and the last of the provisions. Even worse, the Indians had followed them and set up ambushes along the way. Warriors would appear without warning, shoot arrows, and then vanish into the forest. Several men and horses were wounded from these attacks. It goes without saying that the Apalache were masters at this kind of warfare. Cabeza de Vaca almost admired their skill, writing, quote, there are a people wonderfully well built, very lean and of great strength and agility. The bows they use are as thick as an arm, so they can shoot arrows 200 paces with such great skill that they never miss their target. End quote. After a horrific 9-day journey, the expedition arrived at the village of Ayut, but there was to be no relief. The Indians had evacuated and burnt the village to the ground in advance of their arrival. The only food to be found was that which was still growing in the small fields. And to make matters worse, many of the Spanish became ill at this time, which was probably typhoid. It is an illness that causes a high fever, fatigue, diarrhea, and intestinal bleeding. Without treatment, its mortality rate is around 20%. Over the following days, around 40 men succumbed to the illness. They could simply go no further. The expedition, which had once numbered 600, was now reduced to just 250 men. It was estimated they were 1 day away from the coast, and so Narvaez decided to press on. Either the men continued forward or were left behind. Cabeza de Vaca wrote, quote, it was a great sorrow and pain to see the necessity and hardship in which we found ourselves. End quote. But there was one final disappointment. As they approached the coast, it only revealed a huge shallow bay. The water was only waist deep. There was simply no way a ship could reach this place. It had been 4 months since they had abandoned the ships, and they were completely on their own. Cabeza de Vaca wrote, quote, I refrain here from telling this at greater length, because each one can imagine for himself what could happen in a land so strange and so poor and so lacking in every single thing that it seemed impossible either to be in it or to escape from it. End quote. Now, I'm going to stick with Narvaez and the men for now, as I don't want to ruin the flow of the story. But just know that they will never see the ships again. At the end of the video, I will tell you what became of the fleet. But for now, let's continue with the men on shore. Narvaez and his men were out of ideas. They set up camp beside the shallow bay and gave it a grim name, the Bay of Horses. It earned that title because every third day they were forced to slaughter a horse for food. The supply of maize, beans and squash they had raided from the villages was running out. By now, these starving castaways looked like wild men. They made bonfires and roasted horse flesh and devoured every part of the carcass. In fact, 11 years later, another Spanish expedition came across this place and found a pile of horse skulls and crosses carved into trees. These men were losing all ties to civilization. Utterly desperate, they came up with one final plan. They decided their best chance was to construct 5 makeshift rafts and sail out into the Gulf of Mexico. Either they would be spotted by ships, or they would try to sail down the coast to Mexico, where there may be a Spanish outpost. It was a last-ditch attempt at rescue, and to be honest, a little suicidal, but it was the best they had. By the way, agreeing to this plan hadn't been easy. After arriving at the bay, the men with horses had secretly planned to abandon the others and go off on their own. They figured they had a better chance of survival without being stuck with the sick and wounded. However, Narvaez found out about the scheme and made it clear they would be committing a terrible crime by abandoning their leader. Eventually, the horsemen agreed to stay and pursue the plan of the rafts. And anyway, once the horses were killed for food, the decision became irreversible. The expedition would survive or die together. And so began the construction of the rafts, which was a Herculean task in their weakened state. The men needed axes and saws in order to fell the trees for wood, but they had none, so they were forced to say goodbye to their crossbows, swords, armor, and stirrups. They threw them into the fire, and the metal was reworked into the crude tools they desperately needed. One of the men had constructed a forge by making bellows out of deer hides and hollowed out logs that were used as pipes to drive air into the flames. This was a symbolic moment for the expedition. They were trading the very things that defined them as conquistadors, weapons and horses, for a chance at survival. From this point forward, they no longer possessed the technology that gave them such an advantage against the Indians. Narvaez and his men were stranded in the New World, naked and alone. Anyway, for weeks the men worked non-stop on the rafts. None of the men were shipbuilders, and it was an enormous challenge. Each raft would have to carry 50 men, along with fresh water, a supply of corn, and the few remaining weapons. These were not small vessels, merely carrying a few people. If you add up the weight of all the passengers and equipment, each raft would need to transport approximately 5 tons. And of course, the men only had access to the materials around them. They agonized over the correct choice of tree to cut, searching for timber that was dense enough to be strong, but light enough to float. Cutting them down drained what little strength they had left, and to ensure that every member of the expedition did his fair share of the labor, Narvaez made it clear that only those who worked would be allowed to eat the horse meat. It was a harsh rule for the sick men. To tie the logs together, the men needed rope, but they didn't have any. They overcame this by braiding the hair of the dead horses together. It took countless hours, and by the end, they had used the tails and manes of 30 horses. But somehow, it worked. This isn't in my script, but I just want to pause here and say, you really can't fault the resourcefulness of these men. I mean, they had access to nothing, but somehow were making it work. I think you have to admire that. Anyway, in order to control the vessels at sea, the men carved oars out of cypress wood, but they knew that would not be enough. They constructed masts and stitched together their remaining clothing to make sails. They were now, quite literally, nearly naked. The issue of storing fresh water proved to be an especially difficult problem. In the modern world, we take for granted plastic containers, But when you have nothing, what do you use? Making pots out of clay would have been a good solution, and that's how the local Indians did it. But it seems as if there was no suitable clay by the coast. Instead, the men skinned the legs of the dead horses and dried the hides in order to make leather water bags. This was an ingenious solution, but it will backfire soon enough. So at last, after 6 weeks of backbreaking work, the rafts were complete. There was only one horse left, and the men killed it and shared the meat, enjoying what would likely be their last good meal for the foreseeable future. Then came the farewells. The men shook hands and muttered prayers, and then, one by one, they climbed onto their respective rafts. With 50 men on each one, there was hardly any space to move, and worse, they were just a few inches above the waterline. For many of the conquistadors, this was especially frightening as they could not swim. All they could do was cling on for dear life. On September 22nd, 1528, the castaways set sail. Narvaez piloted the lead raft, taking with him many of the strongest and healthiest men. A second raft was commanded by the friars and religious personnel. The third raft was placed under the charge of the two captains I mentioned earlier, Alonso del Castillo and Andres Dorantes. A fourth raft was given to 2 other captains, and the fifth was commanded by none other than Cabeza de Vaca. The royal treasurer later recalled this moment, writing, quote, "And so greatly can necessity prevail, that it made us risk going in this manner, and placing ourselves in a sea so treacherous, and without any one of us who went having any knowledge of the art of navigation." End quote. For the first week, the men navigated a series of small islands, which were a barrier to the open sea. The water was never deeper than chest height, so it gave the men a gentle introduction into life on the rafts. On the 7th day, they came to an island, which is thought to be modern-day St. Vincent Island. But as they approached the shore, they saw a group of Indians with 5 canoes pull up alongside the beach. At the sight of the Spaniards, the Indians fled into the island, and the men quickly stole the canoes. However, they didn't actually plan on using them as transport. Instead, they used the wood to add gunnels to the sides of the rafts. This improvement helped keep some of the water out and improved their quality of life. The men also found some houses along the shore and quickly investigated them. Inside, they found mullets and dried deer meat. This small food discovery boosted their spirits, and Cabeza de Vaca wrote it was, quote, "a great help for the necessity in which we found ourselves," end quote. Anyway, after this brief stop, the rafts headed for the first time into the open sea. They kept as close to the coast as possible, drifting west in the direction of Mexico. For 2 weeks, the expedition made surprisingly good progress. Whenever possible, they steered into sheltered inlets and searched for freshwater streams to refill their leather water bags. At times, they spotted Indian fishermen along the shore, who quickly vanished from sight. However, soon enough, conditions began to deteriorate. A month after they had first set out, their rations were running dangerously low. But water had become the biggest issue. The leather bags they had fashioned from horsehide began to rot. On the rafts, salt water soaked them constantly, and the sun baked them dry. The men were helpless as the precious fresh water leaked away. And for days they searched for streams along the coast, but could find none, until at last they spotted an island and thought it was worth investigating. However, shortly after landing, a storm whipped up out of nowhere. You might think this would be a good thing because of rainwater, but unfortunately it was not. This storm brought no rain, just gale-force winds which sent the ocean into a frenzy of white water. The rafts could not be launched in such conditions, and so the men were trapped. The Spaniards searched every inch of the island, hoping to find even a muddy puddle to drink from, but everything was bone dry. By this point, Narvaez and his men were suffering from severe dehydration. After 5 days, the men could not resist any longer. Many did the unthinkable and drank seawater. Cabeza de Vaca describes the choice, writing, quote, "And some were so careless in doing so that suddenly 5 men died on us." End quote. Drinking salt water is the worst thing you can do when already dehydrated. The body is forced to dilute the excessive sodium levels by further pulling water out from your cells, including your brain. Before long, the kidneys shut down and the unfortunate person can suffer from seizures and brain damage. Death comes quickly. Cabeza de Vaca recalled these dark moments by merely writing, quote, "I do not think there is a need to tell in detail the miseries and hardships in which we found ourselves, since considering the place where we were and the little hope we had of survival, each one can imagine a great deal of what would happen there." End quote. The situation was utterly desperate, and the remaining men were forced to make a hard choice. It was either die slowly of thirst on the island, or risk the fury of the sea once more. The decision was unanimous. They would return to the rafts and place their fate in the hands of God. The men launched the rafts and were immediately assaulted by the enraged sea. Waves rose up and swallowed each vessel, only for them to reappear moments later through a burst of white spray. The men clung to each other and shouted prayers as they were hurled up and down, left and right. Somehow, the rafts remained buoyant enough for the water to not swamp them completely, but the men themselves were breaking down one by one. The salt spray was only furthering their dehydration. However, at last, by pure luck, as the light began to fade, the men rounded a bend in the coastline and found that the waters beyond were calm and sheltered. They had survived the storm. And better yet, Indian canoes soon appeared from the shore. They came out to meet the voyagers and signalled that the Spaniards should follow them. Exhausted and delirious, the men obeyed, and soon enough they were guided to land, where there were a few Indian houses. The castaways could scarcely believe their luck. The Indians offered them cooked fish and pots of fresh water. It was nothing short of a miracle. The chief of the village invited Narvaez into his house, and in exchange, the captain offered him some simple beads and bells that he still possessed. However, it was all too good to be true. That night, for reasons that remain unclear, the Indians attacked some of the sick men who were sleeping on the beach. 3 Spaniards were killed. The Indians also attempted to seize Narvaez inside the chief's house, but he managed to resist their attempts, despite suffering a wound to the head. The men, in a panic, retreated to their rafts along the shore, and throughout the night, the Indians attacked 3 times. Luckily, this group did not possess many arrows, so mainly threw stones at the Spaniards, keeping them on edge. When morning finally came, a strong gale had blown in, so the men were prevented from taking to the rafts. They were forced to endure another day of minor conflict, but they took the opportunity to take some of the Indian pots and fill them up with water. At last, once the weather cleared, they were back in the rafts and on their way. However, just 3 days later, water was running low once again. With little choice, they steered the rafts back towards the shore, knowing full well that Indians could be waiting for them. And they were. A canoe quickly appeared and came over to the lead raft. The Indians jumped aboard, showing no signs of fear at these strange men. Narvaez asked for water, and the Indians agreed, but only if they were given the pots the Spanish possessed. Now, this was a huge risk. The men could not afford to lose those pots, but were also in desperate need of water. Narvaez pleaded with the Indians through sign language, and eventually they came to a solution. 2 members of the expedition would accompany the Indians ashore, and 2 Indians would remain on the rafts as a guarantee. From the expedition, a brave Greek man named Doroteo Teodoro volunteered to go ashore, and he brought with him an African slave. Together they were taken to land in a canoe and swiftly disappeared from sight. The men waited on the rafts until that evening the Indians returned. However, the pots were still empty, and there was no sign of Teodoro or the slave. Worse still, the Indians began to gesture at the two indigenous captives on the rafts, urging them to jump overboard and escape. The Spanish restrained them, not wanting to lose what little leverage they had. So all in all, the day had passed and they still had no water, and now 2 of their own were missing. The following morning, several canoes approached the rafts and demanded the release of the 2 captives. Narvaez replied, making it clear they would only be let free if the 2 Christians were returned alive. Soon, tensions escalated, and the Indians began hurling stones and throwing spears at the rafts. Luckily, the wind picked up, and the rafts were able to make an escape before anyone was injured. By the way, the Greek man and the slave were left behind and never seen again. A later expedition found out they had both been killed shortly after being taken inland. There is no record of what the Spanish did with the 2 Indian captives, although we can likely assume they too were killed. Now, the next day, the castaways caught a major break. They drifted into the outflow of an enormous river, what we now know as the Mississippi, in modern-day southeastern Louisiana. The sheer volume of fresh water pouring into the Gulf meant that the men were able to scoop up drinkable water directly from the surface. I imagine that they had never tasted anything better. But unfortunately, the men did not get to enjoy the moment for long. The immense power of the river's discharge meant that the current pulled the rafts away from shore. And to complicate things further, the wind picked up at the same time and blew directly out towards the open sea. In a matter of minutes, the men found themselves almost 2 miles away from the coast. They pulled at the oars with all their remaining strength. Everyone knew that if they lost sight of land, they were as good as dead. This battle continued for 2 full days, until finally they fought their way back to the coast and into shallow water. From the rafts, the men spotted smoke rising into the distance, a sign of Indians and potentially food. But they were too exhausted to risk another confrontation as the light began to fade, and so decided to wait until morning. And as fate would have it, they would never get the chance. That night, they failed to anchor the rafts properly, and in the darkness, the wind quietly carried them out to sea. When Cabeza de Vaca awoke, he could only see 2 tiny rafts on the horizon. He called his men to the oars and eventually caught up to the closest one, which turned out to be Narvaez's raft. The men spoke about what they should do, and Cabeza stated they should follow the other raft, as it was vital they all stayed together. However, Narvaez disagreed. He declared he was returning to land immediately, even if it meant abandoning the others. And this is where things really unravel. Cabeza de Vaca and his men tried to keep up with Narvaez's raft as they headed for land, but the wind and currents were too strong. Besides, Narvaez's raft was the lightest, and he had the healthier men, so it wasn't long before it began to pull away. As the gap widened, Cabeza de Vaca called out and begged Narvaez to throw him a line, but the expedition leader refused. He replied, quote, "It was no time for some men to rule over others, but that each one should do whatever seemed best to save his life." End quote. With those words, after over a year of struggle, Narvaez had effectively abandoned his command. Every raft was left to fend for themselves. Out of options, Cabeza ordered his men to sail towards the 3rd raft that was on the horizon. This one was piloted by the 2 unnamed captains. They stayed together for over 4 days, but could not get back to land. Now they had fresh water after resupplying from the Mississippi, but their only food was a handful of raw corn per day. It wasn't long before starvation began to take hold. The men had no strength to row, and soon a storm blew in and separated the 2 rafts. By this point, the men were barely alive. Cabeza de Vaca wrote, quote, "The people began to faint in such a manner that when the sun set, all those who came in my raft were fallen on top of one another in it, so close to death that few were conscious." End quote. Only Cabeza and the helmsman still stood, and they took turns trying to steer the raft towards land. However, in the dead of night, Cabeza de Vaca wrote, quote, "The helmsman told me that I should take charge of the raft because he was in such condition that he thought he would die that very night." End quote. As the long hours of darkness dragged on, the men came to grips with their doom. But then, just before dawn, Cabeza de Vaca heard the sound of waves breaking. He mustered the helmsman awake, who had recovered a little somehow, and he too heard the noise. When the sun finally rose, it illuminated the most incredible sight. Land was just 3 miles away. With salvation in reach, the men found a burst of strength. They took to the oars and rowed with all their might. As they neared the beach, a huge wave threw them onto the sand, and the raft broke apart on impact. The broken men crawled onto land for the first time in days, unable to believe they were still alive. Soon, they found pools of rainwater and were even able to start a small fire. The men huddled around it on the lonely beach and roasted what remained of their corn. Since launching the rafts 6 weeks earlier, Cabeza de Vaca and his men had travelled roughly 800 miles. They did not know it, but they had reached an island off the coast of modern-day Texas. What an extraordinary journey that is. Now, before we continue with Cabeza de Vaca, I will pause here to tell you the fate of the other men and how their stories ended. Somehow, against all odds, all 5 rafts reached different parts of the same coastline. The first raft I will wrap up is the one piloted by the 2 unnamed captains. In fact, they travelled the furthest out of any of the vessels. Cabeza de Vaca had been with them only days earlier, after Narvaez abandoned the expedition, and before the storm had separated them. Well, the storm would push the raft another 150 miles west for several days. The conditions on board must have been appalling. When Cabeza had last been with them, they were already wasting away from starvation. It is likely that when the raft eventually landed, some of the men had already died. But reaching land would not help their situation. Soon after coming ashore, an Indian tribe known as the Camones attacked them. The Spaniards were so skinny and weak, they had no chance to defend themselves. Every single man was killed. Talk about an unlucky ending. The second raft, commanded by the religious men, reached land by the mouth of the San Bernard River. Upon landing, their raft was damaged beyond repair, leaving them stranded. The group decided to push on by foot along the coast, surviving on crabs and seaweed. Now, miraculously, they eventually ran into Narvaez and his crew, who had landed just a little further down the coast. The men were overjoyed to see each other alive. Any friendly face in this wretched place was a welcome sight. With the 2 groups joined together, everyone felt a little safer. The Indians would be wary to attack such a large band of men. However, there was an issue. Narvaez still had his raft, but it could only carry 40 men. Now together, they numbered more than 80. It wasn't long before tensions began to rise as this became a problem, and many men were bitter that Narvaez, who had all but abandoned command, now tried to assert himself once again. However, in the end, Narvaez's arrogance would prove to be his undoing. Since he was afraid of an Indian attack, he slept on the raft while the others camped on shore. 2 men remained with him on board, ready to take the oars. That way, if they were attacked in the night, Narvaez would just sail away, leaving the rest to their fate. However, a few nights later, the wind silently grew in strength and blew the raft out to sea without anyone noticing. By dawn, it had vanished over the horizon. It was the last time the Spanish captain was ever seen alive. Narvaez would have woken up on the raft to nothing but a blue, empty void. He had no water and no food. Perhaps in desperation, he would have killed the other 2 men and resorted to cannibalism. In any case, he could not have lasted long. The Narvaez expedition was officially over. In any case, the group on the beach continued their journey along the coast, led by the religious men. However, winter was coming, Soon they decided to set up camp on the beach and try to survive the cold until spring. It was a brutal few months, and eventually their food ran out. It wasn't long before the men resorted to the most desperate measure of all, cannibalism. Cabeza de Vaca would later find out, quote, "They were people beyond hope and all died that winter of hunger and cold, eating one another," end quote. By March 1st, 1529, only one man remained alive, and he was discovered by Indians. This is how their fate is known. So that leaves us with only 2 rafts unaccounted for, one piloted by Cabeza de Vaca and the other commanded by the 2 captains, Andres Dorantes and Alonso del Castillo, who I mentioned before earlier in the video. The fates of these 2 groups would soon become entwined, so I will stick with the royal treasurer for now. Now, we left Cabeza de Vaca on a lonely beach beside his exhausted crew. After making land, the men did what they could to recover some strength. They made fires to warm themselves and ate some of the remaining corn. One man, who was healthier than the others, was able to climb a tree and discovered that they were in fact on an island. He was then sent to scout out the area and soon found a trail that led to an Indian village, just 1 mile away. Luckily, it was abandoned, and he found some pots to bring back to the others. However, as he walked back down the trail, a small dog appeared behind him. Then he turned to find 3 Indians with bows pointing at him. The Spaniard managed to run back to the others before he could be captured, but they had no time to prepare themselves. Within an hour, 100 Indians surrounded the group. Cabeza de Vaca wrote of his terror in that moment, saying, quote, "Whether or not they were of great stature, our fear made them seem like giants," end quote. Clearly, the Spanish could not fight. Most of the men were unable to stand. Their only chance was to build relations with the Indians. Cabeza approached the warriors and gave out beads as a sign of friendship. Through communicating in sign language, the Indians made it known they would return the next morning with food before disappearing into the darkness. That must have been a very anxious night for the men. There was a chance an attack could come at any moment. The Spaniards lay helpless, completely at the mercy of the indigenous people. However, at sunrise, the Indians did return, carrying fish and dried roots. Over the next few days, they would visit multiple times, bringing food and water. It appeared they were fascinated by these strange creatures that had washed up on their doorstep. So slowly, the Spaniards began to recover some strength. But despite the good nature from the Indians, the men were still eager to be away. I mean, how long could they count on this goodwill? It felt as if the Indians could turn at any moment. So after storing some of the food they were given and acquiring enough water, the men worked on the raft and made it ready. When the time came, they removed their clothes as they wanted to keep them dry and dragged the raft into the sea. But this time, they would not get far. Before they cleared the shallows, a huge wave struck the raft and overturned it. The men dropped the oars and were thrown into the freezing, raging sea. By the time they swam back to land, they were shivering uncontrollably and exhausted. In fact, the launching of the rafts was such a disaster, 3 men drowned in the attempt. Back on the beach, reality sunk in. They had lost all their remaining provisions, including their clothes. The castaways were quite literally naked in a new world. I think it's worth taking a moment to just consider their position. I don't know if anyone watching plays any video games, but for me, that is the comparison that comes to mind. Often in certain games, especially role-playing games like the Elder Scrolls, your character starts off in a strange, unexplored world, often with very little possessions and unequipped for the journey to come. For me, that is exactly the situation Cabeza de Vaca found himself in. He was alone, far away from home, in a land he didn't understand. What a terrifying place to be. Anyway, the men returned to their camp and luckily found some embers in the campfire, which they rekindled. There they sat, thinking about all their misfortune and past mistakes. Cabeza described the gathering, writing, quote, "And thus we were beseeching our Lord for mercy and the pardon of our sins, shedding many tears, each one having pity not only for himself, but for all the others whom they saw in the same state." End quote. The group had reason to feel hopeless, even beyond their immediate misery. It was November, and winter was soon approaching. While today the coast of Texas experiences more temperate winters, you should know that 500 years ago it was quite different. From the 1300s to the 1800s, the world was in a period of cooling, and data suggests that the winters of 1527 to 1529 were especially severe in North America. For the men on the beach, this was an existential threat. Anyway, later that evening, there was an interesting encounter. The Indians returned with food as usual and were shocked to see the plight of the Spanish. Cabeza de Vaca explained to them what had happened through signs and showed them the bodies of the drowned men. And then, in an extraordinary moment, quote, "With the great grief and pity they felt on seeing us in such a state, they all began to weep loudly, and so sincerely that they could be heard a great distance away." End quote. The men were taken aback by this strong emotion from the indigenous people, but it also made them feel worse about themselves. Remember, the Spanish viewed the Indians as being primitive and unsophisticated. To be reduced to an object of their pity was just proof of how far they had fallen. So, with no other choice, Cabeza de Vaca begged the islanders to take them in. Without their help, they would die from exposure or hunger within days. Luckily, the Indians seemed to agree to the idea. However, even in their wretched state, there were a few Spaniards who refused to go with them. They were terrified of being victims of human sacrifice, having heard many tales of such things. In the end, 5 men would choose to stay on the beach, which is a decision they will soon come to regret. Cabeza de Vaca and the others, around 40 men, were led to the village. The Indians had lit many fires, and a celebration was soon underway. They danced and sang songs all night long, while the terrified Spaniards huddled together. Cabeza wrote, quote, "For us there was neither rejoicing nor sleep, as we were awaiting the moment when they would sacrifice us." End quote. But eventually dawn would come, and the men were relieved to find the Indians continued to offer them food and acted friendly. I think we should recognize just how generous the Indians were being here. Feeding an additional 40 men would have been a significant drain of resources for such a small village, and yet they did it with little asking. The men were exceptionally fortunate for the time being. The first day in the village would reveal another surprise. Cabeza de Vaca spotted a native carrying some European objects that had not come from their raft. Curious, he asked the man where he found the items, and to everyone's astonishment, the Indian responded through signs that there was another group of men, just like them, also on the same island. The men couldn't believe it. Were there other survivors? Cabeza immediately dispatched 2 men to go and find them, but they didn't get far. Shortly after, the 2 captains, Andres Dorantes and Alonso del Castillo, arrived in the village along with their men. The reunion was a rare moment of joy. Weeks had passed since they had last seen one another near the mouth of the Mississippi River, and each group had long since assumed the others had been lost at sea. But by some miracle, they had arrived at opposite sides of the very same island. The 2 captains also had some good news. They were still in possession of their raft. Perhaps it would be possible for some men to carry on. After talking it out, it was decided the strongest men would attempt the voyage once more. The rest would stay in the village, recover some health, and then journey on foot in the spring when the weather improved. Mexico couldn't be far now, and somewhere there would be Spanish settlements. It was the best chance they had. However, when the raft was launched a few days after the reunion, it quickly sank, drowning their hopes with it. There would be no more voyaging. The castaways were on their own on the island. Now, the winter that followed can only be described as horrific. The island was relentlessly battered by storms and freezing conditions. Even the natives, who were experts of living off the land, struggled to hunt and gather enough food. Their main source of nourishment was through fishing, yet for reasons unknown, perhaps the severity of the weather, this became unreliable. Another staple of their diet was nutritious roots, probably cattails, that they dug up from underwater with great difficulty. The result was this: the natives didn't have enough food to feed themselves, never mind the Spanish. Within a 3-month period, the group of 80 was reduced to just 18 survivors. It's hard to comprehend how horrendous those months must have been. Men must have been dying next to each other almost every day. By the way, the island that the men found themselves on was the home of 2 separate indigenous groups. One was called the Capoques and the other the Hands. Cabeza de Vaca lived with one of them, while the captains Dorantes and Castillo lived with the other. At first, they were allowed to visit one another freely, but that quickly changed. You see, what began as a kind of guest-host relationship quickly turned into something darker: master and slave. The reality was, despite their initial generosity, the Indians could not support the additional mouths. As soon as food became scarce, they stopped offering any to the castaways. The message was clear: if you want food, you will have to work for it. And it's no surprise the Spanish were woefully unprepared to subsist themselves. They did not understand the local fishing methods and were useless with the bow and arrow. In order to provide value, they were forced to do the women's work of collecting firewood and gathering roots. By contributing this way, the natives would offer them just enough food to keep them alive. But as spring drew closer, one event occurred which put the life of every castaway in jeopardy. Do you remember the 5 men who had decided to stay on the beach due to their fear of the natives? Well, that had been a big mistake. Without food, they stood no chance. When the Indians went to check on them, only one man was left, and he had succumbed to cannibalism. Cabeza wrote, quote, "Only one remained because he was very alone and had no one to eat him." End quote. The Indians were appalled by this behavior, which they viewed as a grave sin. As a result, many wanted to kill all of the Spanish and be rid of them right then. Eventually, cooler heads prevailed, but it was a close call and a reminder of how fragile their position was. The physical and psychological suffering they endured cannot be overemphasized. They endured the bitter cold utterly naked. Their fingers bled from scavenging for roots, and their backs hurt from carrying wood all day. They were beaten with sticks or had their hair pulled for any minor mistakes. One day, 3 of the men walked into the wrong house and were killed as a punishment. The men were constantly on edge that any misunderstanding could lead to their death. Cabeza de Vaca recalled that one man was killed because an elderly Indian woman had dreamt of him. It was a paralyzing and awful way to live. The former royal treasurer had a particularly difficult time because soon he was entirely alone. Every Spaniard with him had been killed or died from hardship. Across the island, the captains Castillo and Dorantes still had a band of around 15 men. Cabeza wished to be with them, but his Indian masters would not permit it. And then one day, Cabeza de Vaca was taken from the island to the mainland and separated completely from the others. To make matters worse, he was suffering from a severe illness, so any kind of physical work was exhausting. It was at this time he learned that the remaining castaways, led by the 2 captains, had decided to make an attempt at marching south. They tried to meet with the royal treasurer, but his Indian masters would not allow it. Besides, Cabeza de Vaca was too sick to walk anyway. He could do nothing but watch as his countrymen departed without him. We will find out the fate of Dorantes and Castillo soon enough. So Cabeza de Vaca remained with the same band of Indians for over a year, travelling back and forth from the island to the mainland. The natives were a nomadic people. They rarely stayed in the same place for more than a couple of weeks. They followed the seasons, and food dictated everything. For Cabeza, this meant constant motion. He submitted himself to the routine of hunger and migration. However, his Indian captives treated him poorly and worked him near to death. As a result, he decided to run away to another band called the Charukurs that lived in a forest on the mainland, as he felt they would treat him better. And so began a new chapter in Cabeza de Vaca's life. He was alone in North America, living at the mercy of the very people he had come to conquer. To survive, he could do only one thing: make himself useful. And that's exactly what he did. The band who held him discovered he could serve an important purpose. In a bizarre turn of events, they sent him out across the land as a kind of trader, moving from one Indian group to another, carrying valuable goods such as seashells, feathers, and ochre, which is a red pigment used in body paintings and rituals. Cabeza was a good fit for this role because he belonged to nowhere. He was not tied to a specific clan or group, and this meant he could cross territories without permission. Besides, he possessed no weapons or armor. In the minds of the Indians, he didn't pose any threat. Now, there are two things I want to highlight here. Firstly, the travels of Cabeza de Vaca during these years are perhaps entirely unique to history. Without knowing it, he was becoming something no European had been before, a witness to the inner life of an entire continent. His experiences and later writings would become one of the earliest detailed descriptions of the peoples of North America. He observed their trade networks, their social structures, seasonal rhythms, and daily lives in a way no European ever had. It is a rare glimpse of North America before the entire continent was fundamentally transformed by conquest, politics, and European migration. It really is quite incredible. In fact, this experience would radically transform Cabeza de Vaca himself. For the first time, he began to view the Indians as fellow human beings. You see, conquistadors were led to believe the natives were primitive, inferior, and even without souls. But years of observation stripped those assumptions away. He walked their lands, learned their languages, and shared in their hardships and triumphs. In time, he came to admire them deeply. And secondly, more immediate to his survival, during these wanderings, Cabeza began to form a mental map of the lands around him. He learned where food could be found, which rivers could be crossed, and which regions were best avoided. More than this, he began to build a reputation as a trusted trader. In small communities, reputation is everything, and if he was ever going to escape, it would give him an advantage. Anyways, after 3 years of wandering the lands, Cabeza decided he would attempt to move south towards Mexico. After setting out, he joined a band of Indians called the Kevanez, and from them he learned some astonishing news. They told him that further south there were 3 other white men who were still alive. Cabeza de Vaca was stunned. He had long thought of himself as the sole survivor of the expedition. However, the Indians also warned him that the 3 men were being treated badly by their captors. Without hesitation, Cabeza set off to find them. Guided by the Kevanez, Cabeza eventually came to a small village on a large river. As he approached one of the houses, Andres Dorantes stepped out. They were both speechless at seeing one another alive. Cabeza de Vaca wrote, quote, "We gave many thanks to God upon finding ourselves reunited, and this day was one of the days of greatest pleasure that we have had in our lives." End quote. It was autumn 1532, and they had not seen each other for 3.5 years. Dorantes then led Cabeza to 2 other survivors, fellow captain Alonso del Castillo and an African slave named Esther Benico. Now, I have failed to mention Esther Benico in the story so far, mainly because he was not relevant or named specifically in any prior event. However, he absolutely deserves a quick mention here, being one of the remaining 4 men. Estebanico was a black slave from northwest Africa. He had first been enslaved by the Portuguese before being sold on in the Spanish slave markets. Captain Dorantes was his master. His survival to this point is amazing, considering he would almost certainly have been among the least fed and least protected members of the expedition, due to being a slave. But that's what gave him his edge. Having endured the nightmare of servitude for most of his life, he was physically and mentally resilient to such suffering. I mean, if you think about it, the current situation would have been far more distressing for Cabeza and the 2 captains, as they were not used to a life of enslavement. But Estebanico was, and he knew how to survive above all else. By now, he had endured slavery on 3 different continents. I think he deserves some respect. Anyways, at the reunion, the 2 captains and Estebanico told their story to Cabeza de Vaca. 3 years earlier, they had left the island with 12 men and set out along the coast towards the south. For weeks, they had traversed difficult terrain, crossing rivers and large bays. During the journey, some men had drowned, while others had been killed by Indians. At last, they were the only 3 remaining. In order to save themselves from starvation, they had been forced to submit to the local Indians. And so here they were. Now, with the 4 men reunited, they felt a sense of renewed hope. Cabeza announced he planned to journey south to Mexico and hopefully arrive at a Spanish settlement. And so together, the men devised a plan to escape these lands once and for all. We should know that this meeting between the castaways was very fortunate, since Dorantes belonged to an Indian band named the Mariamas, and Castillo and Estebanico belonged to another group called the Iguaces. By the way, I've almost certainly butchered that last pronunciation, but I really can't find any source material for it, so forgive me. The only reason the castaways found themselves together at this river was because each year many bands gathered there to harvest pecan nuts. It's an example of how the Indians moved across the land following their food. And so the survivors intended to use those same movements to their advantage. They knew that every summer their Indian captives travelled south for about 100 miles in order to harvest a particular type of food, the prickly pear. The area was covered by hundreds of thousands of cacti that bore these fruits, enough to sustain several Indian bands for a few months. The plan was simple. The castaways would follow their masters to this eating ground, stock up on food, and then sneak off together, heading south, where hopefully they would find other tribes. It was the best chance they had, but it required patience. Soon enough, the survivors separated once more. Castillo and Estebanico left together, while Cabeza was able to remain with Dorantes. At least this time, nobody was truly alone. And so the royal treasurer and the captain Dorantes moved on with the band known as the Mariamas. Dorantes was able to teach their language to Cabeza, which made life a lot easier. As they ranged with the tribe into new hunting grounds, the Texas landscape opened up around them. Wide grazing plains stretched towards the horizon. Cabeza de Vaca would later write that he believed these lands would be excellent for cattle, which is an observation that would be shared by many others nearly 3 centuries later. He reported an abundance of wildlife, such as deer, elk, coyotes, and wolves, and even became one of the first outsiders to lay eyes on the iconic buffalo. Yet despite this abundance of life, there were times when the tribe struggled to hunt enough food, and the men often went hungry. Both men spent the winter and spring of 1533 with the Mariamas, and then at last, in the summer, the band moved south towards the prickly pears. There, among the cactus fields, they were reunited with Castillo and Estebanico, and the men were thrilled to see each other once again. It was almost time to hatch their plan. However, as they prepared for the journey ahead, disaster struck. The Indians who held the survivors got into an argument amongst themselves over a woman. The conflict turned violent, with fights breaking out between different bands. When the dust had settled, the Indians had packed their stuff and were moving on from each other. It was a heartbreaking moment for the 4 castaways. They had not yet gathered enough provisions to survive on their own. Once again, they had no choice but to follow their respective masters and split up. Cabeza de Vaca wrote, quote, "We Christians were forced to part company, and there was no way for us to get together until the following year." End quote. The next 12 months were brutal for Cabeza de Vaca. The Mariamas worked him hard and reduced the quantity of his food. That winter, he ran away 3 times, unable to control his hunger. During this period, he began wandering from group to group, surviving as best he could. But somehow, when summer came in 1534, all 4 men once again found themselves at the Prickly Pear grounds. It had been more than 5 years since they had first joined the Indians on the island off the coast of Texas. Cabeza de Vaca told the others he was not taking any more chances. In 1 month's time, when the moon became full, he was leaving with or without them. He could not endure this life any longer. The others agreed, and that very same day were split up by their masters. There was no turning back now. And at last, when the moon hung full in the sky, all 4 men slipped away from their captors and reconvened together under the stars. They wasted no time. With fear and joy, they fled to the south as quickly as they could. For those first few days, the men anxiously looked behind them, expecting at any moment to see their masters in pursuit. But as the miles passed and no one came, their confidence grew. They were free for now. Their goal was to reach Panaco, a coastal region of Mexico where they would find Spanish settlements. The quickest route would have been to follow the Gulf Coast, keeping the sea in sight. However, the men knew the coast was heavily populated by Indians, not all of them friendly. Because of that, they decided to stick inland. With winter approaching, food would soon grow scarce. Whether they liked it or not, they would need the help of Indians they met along the way. The 4 travellers soon came in contact with a band called the Avavares, and to their surprise were welcomed with open arms. To their astonishment, the Indians had heard of them and were even delighted to see them. And this is where a new chapter in the life of the castaways begins. Let me explain what was going on here. Years before, when the men were first enslaved on the island, Cabeza de Vaca had occasionally performed simple ceremonies for the Indians. When someone in the village fell ill, he would make the sign of the cross over them and recite prayers to God. At times, the person would go on to recover. It had been simple and infrequent, but apparently word had travelled far. Across hundreds of miles, the story had spread that the castaways were powerful medicine men, capable of healing the sick. Without even knowing it, they were famous. Now, of course, the men used this reputation to their advantage. It was a way of securing food and safety from the Indians. However, Cabeza de Vaca actually believed they had been blessed by some divine power. The men began to view their insane journey as a kind of trial from God. And to be honest, you can see why. They were the last 4 survivors out of 300 men. The only answer that made sense to them was that they had been spared for some greater purpose. And it seems as if somehow, by whatever explanation, the men actually did manage to heal some of the sick. Whether it was luck, the placebo effect, or something else, the Indians became convinced that none could die while the Spanish were near. And it's easy to see why the Indians would think the castaways were special. They looked different, claimed to have come from a distant land, and spoke strange languages. The Indians began calling them the children of the sun because they had come from the east across the great ocean. With every day, the legend of the Spaniards grew. The men decided to rest and spend the winter with the Avavares before continuing their inland journey in the early summer of 1535. The route took them through much of South Texas into a land of thickets and dense undergrowth. Cabeza de Vaca wrote, quote, The land is so rugged and impassable. We were bleeding in many places from the thorns and brambles that we encountered." End quote. Occasionally, the men would fall in with a band of Indians, hail in return for food and water, and then continue on their way. This experience led the men to witness a wide range of different people. The Indians of South Texas left the strongest impression on the castaways. They were tall, strong, lean, and cunning in battle. The royal treasurer wrote, quote, "These are the people most fit for war of all I have seen in the world." End quote. At last, the men came upon a huge river, which was almost certainly the Rio Grande. The men were very close to their final goal. Do you remember the fabled Mexican river that the expedition had originally been searching for? Where it was now just around 90 miles to the south, and just 100 miles beyond that was the first Spanish outpost along the Mexican coast. If they just continued on, they would arrive in a matter of weeks. However, it was here that the four men made a remarkable decision. Without warning, they suddenly abandoned the coast and headed west and north, delving further into the unexplored interior and away from salvation. We don't know what drove them to suddenly change course in such a drastic fashion, but perhaps by now the Spanish world no longer felt like home. I mean, for years they had lived among the people of the continent. They had learned their languages, shared their hunger, and walked their land. They belonged nowhere and to no one. An entire continent stretched before them, and they were happy to go wherever the road took them. Besides, everywhere they travelled, the men were celebrated for their powers. It felt as if they were on a mission to help these people. The transformation from conquistador to healer is so dramatic, it might be the most extraordinary part of this entire story. Anyway, soon after crossing the Rio Grande, it became clear that the men had stumbled upon an ancient trade route connecting the eastern coast of Mexico with North America. For over 1,000 years, indigenous merchants had travelled this path, carrying goods across vast distances to new people. The castaways now followed in their footsteps. One day, they encountered two women carrying maize, or corn, which was a revelation for all four men. In all their years wandering Texas, they had never encountered it. Maize was a potential sign of advanced agricultural societies, and the men were excited with what they might discover as they pushed onwards. And shortly after, they saw further signs. A group of people passed them, carrying a copper bell and cotton blankets. Again, the men were astonished. Nowhere in Florida or along the entirety of the Gulf Coast had they encountered copper. Perhaps, after all this time, they were nearing the wealthy civilization they had once dreamed of conquering all those years ago. Now, as the men explored further inland, their legend began to grow. At first they travelled alone, but soon a few people began to follow them. Then it was dozens, and then it was thousands, all drawn in by these stories of the magical men. Cabeza de Vaca wrote that at times they found themselves followed by 3,000 to 4,000 people. I mean, that is just insane. Multiple villages of Indians just followed them wherever they went. After weeks of wandering, the Indians eventually led the four men to a sizable settlement. This was no nomadic village, it was a permanent town, the first they had seen since Florida all those years ago. There were endless fields of corn, beans and squash. The men were relieved beyond words to finally find such abundance. Only days earlier, they had been close to starvation, having crossed a large and barren desert. Cabeza de Vaca and his 3 companions stayed in this settlement for a few weeks, recovering some strength. It is estimated they had walked around 600 miles since deciding to press deeper into the continent. But the men were excited by what they had found. They had seen land no European had ever recorded, and the further they walked, the more signs of advanced crafting and metallurgy they noticed. It felt like they were approaching a sophisticated civilization. The men asked about the country ahead, and the locals told them that further on lived people who possessed great deals of corn. However, the land between was vast and unforgiving. They warned them that the journey would take around 17 days, and along the way there would be nothing to eat. Nevertheless, the castaways set out, following the trail of corn. Now, if you're wondering why Cabeza was so insistent on following this trail of corn, let me explain. As I've mentioned previously, corn agriculture meant permanent settlements, organised trade, larger populations, and potentially complex societies. If corn was available, it meant the group could keep making progress and maybe discover something of great importance. Don't forget that the men were still explorers at heart. And as an interesting side note, the history of corn is quite fascinating. Maize, or corn, originated in Mexico around 8,000 years ago. You see, it didn't exist in the wild in its current form. It was engineered by people. It began by domesticating a wild grass, a plant so small and hard it was barely edible. Over generations, farmers transformed it through careful cultivation into the plant we recognize today. With corn came a food surplus, which ultimately led to population growth. It is fair to say that in much of this continent, civilization has always been tied to corn. Side note done. Anyway, the journey would take far longer than expected. Along the way they met a few Indians who agreed to guide them through the dangerous wilderness. In total, the men would walk for another 3 months before they finally arrived at their destination, what historians call the land of maize. The 4 travelers had in fact reached the fertile valleys of northern Sonora, Mexico, and were now not far away from the Pacific Ocean. Everywhere they went, people continued to follow them and ask for healing. Cabeza wrote that the people here believed they had come from the sky. The Indians would point at the sun and then rub their hands over the castaways' bodies. And then, around Christmas, 1535, Captain Castillo saw an Indian man carrying a Spanish belt buckle. The sight stopped him in his tracks. He asked at once where the man had found it. The Indian replied he had found it from, quote, some men who wore beards like us, who had come from the sky, and who brought horses and lances and swords, end quote. He added that these men had last been seen by the Pacific coast. The excitement amongst the 4 castaways must have been overwhelming. Conquistadors were nearby. After all these years, rescue lay within reach. However, they were also saddened by the news. If the Spanish were here, it would not be long before these people would be pillaged and robbed. They promised the local people they would do whatever they could to prevent any harm from coming to them. After all this time, Cabeza de Vaca found himself standing on the side of the indigenous people. It is a remarkable transformation. Now, the conquistadors the Indians had spotted were part of an expedition that had set out from Mexico City and worked their way up the Pacific coast. They were led by a man named Nuno de Guzman, who even by standards of the day was an extremely ruthless and cruel man. He had already amassed a fortune through slavery in the Caribbean, and his treatment of the natives in the New World was shocking. On this expedition, he drove slaves ahead of him as porters, chaining them with iron collars and confining them in pens at night. As I said, not a very nice man. Since encountering this brutality, the Indians that lived on the coast had abandoned their villages and fields in order to retreat further inland and escape the slavers. But the conquistadors were forever pushing deeper into the territories in search of slaves and riches. It was one of these advance parties that the castaways set out to intercept. After leaving a village in the land of maize, the 4 men trekked towards the coast for around 240 miles until they reached a river. There, on its banks, they spotted the first sign of conquistadors, a recently abandoned camp. It was the first trace of European life the men had seen since the expedition had begun 7 years earlier. The men noticed discarded chains, a reminder that their countrymen were still hell-bent on slavery. Cabeza de Vaca vowed to reach the Spaniards as quickly as possible so he could try to shield the Indians from further harm. The next morning, he set out with Estebanico and 11 Indians in order to track the Spaniards, and the following day, it happened. Cabeza de Vaca spotted 4 conquistadors on horseback in the distance. The royal treasurer, accompanied by Estebanico and his entourage of Indians, walked slowly towards the mounted Spaniards. At first, the horsemen seemed confused as to why these Indians were heading straight for them. By now they had grown accustomed to seeing entire villages flee at the sight of them. But then they noticed other strange details: the dark skin of Estebanico, and then the long beard of Cabeza de Vaca himself. Something here was not quite right. When the two groups came face to face, the royal treasurer spoke in perfect Spanish, and the conquistadors were stunned. Cabeza de Vaca later wrote, quote, "They remained looking at me for a long time, so astonished that they neither spoke to me nor managed to ask me anything." End quote. When the 4 horsemen finally regained their senses, they agreed to lead Cabeza de Vaca to their captain, a man named Diego de Alcaraz, who was camped just a mile away. And here is where things get complicated. You see, the conquistadors were frustrated. For the last few weeks, they had struggled to find any Indians to seize as slaves. And now here was Cabeza de Vaca arriving with a small band at his side. When the conquistador captain learned that 2 more Spaniards, Castillo and Dorantes, were only a few miles away, accompanied by over 600 Indians, his eyes lit up. In his mind, he had hit the jackpot. And then, right on cue, Castillo and Dorantes arrived with their great company of Indians and joined the slavers. Very quickly, negotiations grew tense. The royal treasurer gathered all the authority he could muster and pleaded on the Indians' behalf. He gave a long speech vouching for the good nature of the indigenous people and the richness of their land. He argued that there was enough prosperity for everyone to share. Meanwhile, the slavers were looking at him like he was mad. Why would they share when they could just take? Needless to say, both parties did not see eye to eye. In a last-ditch attempt, Cabeza de Vaca ordered the Indians to flee, but they refused to abandon the healers with these cruel men. The Indians did not understand that both the castaways and the slavers were the same people. Cabeza de Vaca recalled that they said, quote, "We came from where the sun rose, and they came from where it set, that we cured the sick, and they killed those who were well." End quote. In the end, some of the Indians heeded the warning and departed, but a few chose to remain. Cabeza de Vaca had tried, but ultimately failed. His dream of the Spaniards and Indians coexisting was just that, a dream. Anyway, we are almost at the end of our story. The 4 castaways were escorted under guard to the closest Spanish town, around 90 miles away. There they were presented to the mayor, who was astonished to hear they were the survivors of the Narvaez expedition. They were received with honour and given anything required. A few weeks later, they travelled to the town of Compostela, the capital of the province. There they met none other than Nuno de Guzman, the governor and the brutal conquistador I mentioned just a little while ago. The 4 survivors were appalled by the scale of slavery they witnessed and had the courage to say so to Guzman himself. The conquistador quickly grew displeased and sent the castaways on to Mexico City, where they arrived on July 24th, 1536. And so, after setting out from Cuba almost 9 years ago, the 4 men had done it. They had endured starvation, enslavement, sickness, and violence. They had crossed rivers, deserts, mountains, and plains, walking across an entire continent. It is a journey almost without parallel in all of human history. Just remarkable. After reaching Mexico City, the men were treated like celebrities. Everywhere they went, people stopped to talk to the 4 survivors who had seen so much. I will note that it would take some time, if ever, for them to get used to the comforts of town life once again. The royal treasurer wrote, quote, I was unable to wear proper clothes for many days, nor were we able to sleep but on the ground." End quote. Now, with the men back in, quote, the civilized world, I will tell you how their stories ended and the legacy of their epic journey. I will start with the three other men and then finish up with Cabeza de Vaca. So first, the two captains, Andres Dorantes and Alonso del Castillo. Well, both men decided to stay in the New World and in turn became wealthy landowners. Each came from prominent families in Spain, and it wasn't long before both men were married off to wealthy widows. They went on to oversee substantial estates in Mexico, estates that included authority over local Indian populations. How they reconciled this with the lessons of their long captivity, we cannot say. And so, what about Estebanico, the black slave? Well, Estebanico has an interesting place in American history. Some consider him the first black man to explore North America. But besides that, it's hard to comprehend the roller coaster of emotions Estebanico must have felt after reaching Mexico City. As soon as he reached the town, he was once again just regarded as property. Despite the last 8 years enduring the same hardships and hunger as the others, once back under Spanish rule, the old order reasserted itself. He was a slave. And what was his reward for surviving the journey? Well, Andres Dorantes quickly sold him. Yeah, thanks a lot. But there was a reason for the sale. A new expedition was being organized to further explore the lands the castaways had traveled, and they wanted Estebanico to act as a guide. He did not have a choice in the matter. In early 1539, he set out once again. However, this time, his luck would not hold. After entering a native village alone, Estebanico was promptly captured and killed. It seemed the Indians had grown increasingly wary of outsiders. It was an unfortunate ending for the slave. He had survived 10 years of hardship, only to be sent back to the strange lands. In his life, Estebanico had travelled further than most people could imagine, from Africa to Europe, across the Atlantic to North America and Mexico. I am glad that history remembers him. Before I get to Cabeza himself, I just want to wrap up one final loose end: the fate of the ships that had left the Narvaez expedition stranded on the coast of Florida. I promised I would tell you what became of them, so here you go. If you recall, the original plan had been simple. The fleet would sail along the coastline while the land party marched ahead, and the two groups would reunite further north. But as the days turned into weeks, there was still no sign of Narvaez or his men. The ships waited, and then they searched, but there was no trace. For nearly a year, the remaining crew, and the women still aboard, scoured the coastline with no luck. At one point, a ship was even sent all the way back to Cuba in order to gather fresh supplies, and somehow managed to find its way back to the others, which in itself was almost miraculous. But month after month, nothing changed. They spotted no signal fires, no survivors, no messages. As time went by, many aboard began to fear the worst. The land expedition was gone. The women felt the loss especially deeply, many believing their husbands were dead. In fact, as the weeks dragged on, some even formed new relationships with members of the crew. Eventually, supplies ran low again, and the ships had no choice but to abandon the search and return to Cuba, where they shared the news of the expedition's demise. So there you are, just in case you were wondering. And so that brings me at last to Cabeza de Vaca. While in Mexico City, he began to devise a plan to claim a stake in the lands of Florida. I mean, Narvaez was long dead, and who else had better knowledge and experience of the land? Surely the king would respect everything he'd endured. So in August 1537, after more than 10 years away, the royal treasurer returned to Spain and made his way to the royal court. However, he was in for some bad news. The crown had already given the rights away to others. For all his effort over the last decade, he had nothing to show for it. But despite this crushing blow, Cabeza de Vaca was a man transformed by his experiences, and he decided to do something incredibly risky, to tell the truth. In the Spanish court, he described the horrendous treatment of the indigenous people by the conquistadors. He spoke of their societies, their beliefs, and their daily lives, and by doing so, humanized them in a way few others ever had. He openly criticized the brutality of Spanish expeditions and warned that their cruelty only led to destruction, not obedience. In a wider sense, he argued that these were rational beings and should hold the same rights as Christians. It was a stance not at all popular by the royals, who only cared for the wealth of their empire. During this time, he wrote down his epic journey in a book named La Relación. As I mentioned earlier, it is where a lot of the source material from this story comes from. Cabeza de Vaca spent the final years of his life in his home village, living in relative obscurity. It is thought he died in 1559 at around 70 years of age. So there we are. The story of Cabeza de Vaca is complete. I hope you enjoyed this one. In my mind, it was half epic survival and half a story of transformation. Please consider becoming a member on my YouTube channel, as it will allow me to keep making these videos. I hope you are well wherever you are. Thank you and take care.